and buy steel from the Japanese for yen. That's another way to produce steel. And if that's cheaper, that's the better way. At any rate, that was the case. It was cheaper. Why? Because the steel workers were grossly overpaid relative, not to what they wanted or what they deserved as human beings, but relative to what people in similar manufacturing enterprises were getting. For a while competition was allowed to prevail, the wages of steel workers started going down relative to the average. And the steel industry started to hold its own. And then the United States came in. This was long before the present administration or before the Carter administration, and put in some kind of a protective device. I forget the details. It was something called a trigger price, which had the effect of setting a minimum floor. What was the result? Over the next 10 years, there was no more gain in the relative wages of, that is, no more decline in the relative wages of steel workers compared to other workers. And there was no further, there was a further increase in imports of foreign steel. And over the period since then, total employment in steel has gone down sharply. The U.S. has protected it very strongly over the whole, so-called protected. As you can see, it isn't protection, that's a misnomer. What it is a sentence of death. I have said if you look at the record, government protection for an industry is a sentence of death for that industry. And that, I think, is what the record shows in almost every case, and it's understandable why that should be the case. If you take away the spur of competition, you take away the most important force for maintaining efficiency and productivity. I do not believe there's a chance in the world the steel industry would disappear. If we had absolutely free and open competition and no restraints on trade in steel. Why? Because there are great geographical advantages in producing steel where the ore comes out and where the steel is going to be used. And I cannot conceive of that being completely frittered away by inefficiency and lack of productivity. And the same thing goes with almost every other industry people talk about. When people talk about a key industry like oil, they say, well, by God, we can't let the oil industry go. We need that for war. Well, we do. What we need for war is oil, not an oil industry. It's far cheaper to stockpile oil than it is to maintain in existence oil wells that cost a great deal more to exploit than you can buy the oil for from abroad. In any event, it's always seemed to me kind of a mystery about how you preserve the oil reserves of the United States by pumping it out as fast as possible. That seems to me a contradiction in terms. So I suggest to you that Adam Smith's phrase of interested sophistry is a better designation for these various arguments than that they are reasonable or rational. They are rationalizations. Rationalizations of an understandable attempt. Don't misunderstand me. I understand the attempt. If you're in a position where you are seeing somebody beat you out, where you are losing your business, where your income is going down, whether that's because of a domestic competitor or a foreign competitor, I don't blame you for trying to do what you can. I just blame the rest of us for being so weak and silly and foolish as to let you get away with it.
Please define conservative and liberal, and tell us where you place yourself.
Well, the word conservative really doesn't have any real meaning in the sense that if you take it literally in the dictionary meaning, it means to keep things the way they are. And the people who call themselves conservative in general don't want to keep things the way they are. So it's a misnomer. But in practice, if you go down to the way people classify themselves, there are several classes of conservatives. There are the so-called traditional conservatives who believe that practices that have developed over generations and over centuries must have a great deal of merit to them out of the simple evolutionary process by which they've developed. And I believe that is correct. But I'm not one of those, however. I think they have a great deal of merit and something to be said. But there are other classes of conservatives, more classes than you can shake a stick at, and they're not all exactly the same. It's very hard to classify them. Liberal is a different story. The word liberal once had a simple, straightforward meaning, and it still has if you look in the dictionary. It means of and pertaining to liberty. But unfortunately, the people who now in the United States call themselves liberals are not devoted to maintaining liberty. In the main, they are people who should properly be called socialists. Their aim is to have government, or the collectivity as a whole, assume a greater share of responsibility and a greater role in determining the lives of individuals. So I think these terms are both misleading. I like to classify myself as a real liberal, as a liberal in the original sense of the term, but the term is so much misused now that it's hard to do so. And consequently, I am often driven to call myself a libertarian, by which I mean exactly the same thing. Somebody who believes in a free society and who believes that you can only maintain a free society. You can only maintain a free society if government is kept relatively low. That in the words of our framers and our founders, the real threat to human liberty comes from government, not from individuals, and that you have to control it. That's why we have a constitution with checks and balances which sought to limit the scope of government. If I may put this back in the terms you introduced earlier of Tom Sowell's two visions, I would describe the two visions somewhat differently than he did, though I think they ultimately come to the same thing. I would say one vision, and it's my vision, and I think that of most people in the United States, is a vision of the human being, of the human individual, or really better, the family, as the ultimate objective, as the ultimate end, as a thing that's important. As society, as a collection of human individuals who share certain values and who agree to work together for certain objectives. And government, preferably and desirably, as a means whereby people can work together without, so far as possible, limiting their individual separate freedom to pursue their own objectives in their own way, just so long as they don't interfere with anybody else's right to do the same thing. I believe you do need a government to prevent people from coercing one another, to enforce contracts, and for various other purposes. But I believe you only need and to defend against foreign enemies. But you only need a relatively small government. That's one vision. At any rate, the crucial thing about that vision is that the individual, the human being, is the center of it. The other vision is a vision that properly should be called collectivism. It's a vision of there existing some organic unity which has a meaning and a significance outside of the individual. It's the community, the society. In the Marxian language, it's the class. But collectivists are by no means all Marxians. I don't mean to suggest that at all. There are many varieties of collectivism, as there are many varieties of individualism. But the crucial dividing line, I think, is between those who take the individual as the center of the human universe, as it were, and those who take the collectivity, the organism, the collection of individuals, as a central concept in their thinking. So far as the latter are concerned, it is appropriate to override the wishes and desires of the individuals in the name of a higher end that will benefit the community as a whole. And I think those are the two fundamental visions, not these misleading terms currently of liberal and conservative.
We keep hearing about freedom and prosperity and that they are the results of free market capitalism, and I think that's generally acknowledged. But what about the moral and cultural considerations of a society? Aren't they being short-shifted here?
I believe that free markets apply to a much greater and a broader range of considerations than simply buying and selling and exchange, borrowing and lending. That's one kind of market. But tell me, how did we develop a language? Was there a governmental bureau that decided there should be 144,336 words, or whatever the number of words in the dictionary is? Not at all. We developed language through a market, through cooperation among people and speaking with one another, finding new terms to express their ideas, finding ways to communicate with one another. And that though produced by human beings in the terms that Friedrich Hayek uses, the language was not a explicit, deliberate human construct. It was the unintended consequence of voluntary cooperation among individuals. That's language. Take another concept. Take science, modern science. Science was never centrally planned. It never arose out of a government bureau. It arose out of individuals cooperating with one another voluntarily to promote a common objective. That objective wasn't making money, might have been a part of it, but it wasn't the primary objective. The primary objective was to find out the way things worked. Curiosity, trying to understand. The curiosity of an Einstein. He wasn't supported by government except that he had a job as a clerk in a patent office, I believe, in Switzerland. And we go down, none of the great geniuses, very few of them were, they all were individuals who produced their own thing. But the point I'm trying to make is a different one. They were operating in a kind of market in which they were exchanging information with one another. Now we come to your question of basic morals. How did our moral system develop? Well, for some people it was laid down on the mount through a sermon. For other people it was in the 10 tablets brought by Moses from the Mount Sinai. For still other people it's in the writings of Muhammad. Many places where people get morals. But in the end, the common values that people share derive out of a market transaction. It may seem a strange way to talk about it, but I think it's what it really is. The common moral beliefs we have, and we share whether Christians or Jews or Muslims to a large extent, have devised out of finding out how we can best voluntarily cooperate with one another. So I would argue that voluntary cooperation, free exchange of ideas, free speech and thought is the most effective way to promote and maintain a moral philosophy, moral attitudes, to develop moral attitudes, and to maintain them. I do not believe we have seen a growth in morality as government has become larger. I think, factually speaking, that is very hard to support.
As I turn off this tape and walk away, what single thing should I work for in terms of change in the government structure in the United States to preserve these freedoms?
There is no doubt. These freedoms can be preserved only if we can limit the size and scope of the government. We cannot do that, in my opinion, solely by electing the right people to Congress. That may help, but that won't do it, as we've seen. And therefore, I believe the most important thing to work for is for an expansion and extension of constitutional restraints upon the scope of government.